In court, my father stood up as a witness, looked right at the judge, and said with absolute certainty, "The yoga studio and the truck are worth something now." Finally, they belong to Dylan, the boy who actually has what it takes to lead, who has a family, who has a real future. My mother sat beside him, smiled lightly, and gave a few quiet claps as if the matter was already settled. I sat alone at the defendant's table, hands clenched under the wood, watching every eye in the room shift toward me. They all thought I looked defeated. The quiet daughter, the one who always steps back. No one noticed the judge's face change. Judge Ramirez stopped flipping through the file. Her fingers paused on a page. Then she lifted her head slowly and looked straight at me. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "Do you deny everything that has just been said, or is there something you haven't told the court yet?" The room went still. My father's confident expression flickered for the first time. My mother's hands froze mid-clap, and in that second, I knew the story they had all come to hear was about to unravel. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who are supposed to know you best, stick around until the end to see how silence can become the strongest weapon in the room. To understand why I was sitting there alone today, I have to go back to the very beginning of my family. From the moment I could remember, my family had already decided who Dylan was and who I would never be. My younger brother entered every room like he owned it, loud, quick to laugh, always ready with an opinion. My parents saw that as promise. "Dylan's going to do great things," my father would say, one hand on his shoulder as if the future was already signed in his name. Dylan believed it, too. He never doubted he deserved the best spot at the table, the newest toy, the loudest applause. I was the other one. The one who cleaned up after everyone, who finished homework without being asked, who stayed quiet when voices rose. They called me responsible. That word followed me like a shadow. Responsible meant useful, but never special. Responsible meant I didn't need praise because I should already know my place. Birthdays made it clearest. When Dylan turned 8, my parents threw a party in the backyard with a bounce house, pizza truck, and a giant cake shaped like a soccer ball. He tore open gifts until the wrapping paper covered the grass, new bike with gears, video game console, skates. I stood at the edge of the crowd holding a paper plate, smiling because that's what you do. My gift from them was a card with $20 inside and the words, "Keep up the good work." Dylan looked over, grinned, and said, "Thanks for coming, Alex." Everyone laughed like it was funny. I forced a smile and went inside to help my mother clean the kitchen before the party ended. Another year, summer vacation. We drove to the lake house for a week. Dylan sat in the front passenger seat the whole trip, choosing every song, deciding when we stopped for snacks. I sat in the back with the cooler and bags, knees pressed against the seat in front. When we arrived, he picked the bedroom with the best view. I took the fold-out couch in the living room. No one asked. No one needed to. That was just how things worked. The moment that broke something inside me happened when I was 11. Our family had a glass vase on the entry table, something my mother loved, blue and fragile. One afternoon, Dylan was running through the house with a soccer ball. He kicked it hard. The ball hit the table. The vase fell and shattered across the tile. I was in the next room reading. My parents rushed in. Dylan started crying before anyone spoke. It slipped. I didn't mean to. My father looked at the pieces, then at me standing in the doorway. "Alexandra, why didn't you stop him?" he asked. I opened my mouth to explain. I wasn't even there, but my mother cut in. "She's always around when things go wrong." Dylan kept sobbing. My father turned to him, softened. "It's okay, son. Accidents happen." Then he looked back at me. "You're older. You should have been watching. You're grounded for the weekend. No books, no TV." I tried to speak, but my father's voice sharpened. "Enough. You always have an excuse. You're the one who causes trouble." Dylan peeked from behind my mother. Tears drying already, a small smirk when no one was looking. That night I sat on my bed in the dark, pieces of the day replaying. I cried quietly into my pillow so no one would hear. For the first time I understood something cold and clear. Telling the truth didn't matter. Being right didn't matter. Speaking up only made the room colder, the voices louder, the punishment longer. From then on, silence became my safest choice. If I stayed quiet, they couldn't twist my words. If I stayed quiet, I could survive. Years passed that way. High school brought more of the same. Dylan played varsity soccer, got invited to every party, dated the popular girls. My parents attended every game, cheered until their voices cracked. I made honor roll every semester, joined the debate team because it let me speak without anyone interrupting, but they never came to a single match. "We're busy with Dylan's schedule," my mother would say. "You understand, right?" I nodded. I always nodded. I started working part-time at 16, stocking shelves at the local bookstore after school. The money went into a savings account my parents didn't know about. I bought my own clothes, paid for my own phone plan, filled the gas tank without asking. Independence wasn't rebellion. It was protection. If I relied on them, I owed them. If I owed them, they could take. By the time I graduated high school, Dylan was already talking about college scholarships and big plans. I got into a state university with a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. My parents threw him a big send-off party. Mine was a quiet dinner at home. "You'll be fine," my father said, patting my shoulder. "You're responsible." I left for college without fanfare. And for the first time in years, the house felt quieter without me. Not because they missed me. Because the person who always cleaned up, who always stepped aside, was finally gone. That silence I learned as a child stayed with me. It followed me through dorm rooms, late-night shifts, and early mornings. It became part of who I was. Not weakness, survival. But survival has a cost. And years later, when Grandfather Harold left me the yoga studio and the truck, that cost finally came due. Grandfather Harold passed away quietly on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. He had been ill for months, but he never complained. The last time I saw him alive, he handed me an old envelope containing a handwritten will, yellowed paper, his shaky signature at the bottom. "This is yours, Alexandra," he said, pressing the envelope into my hand along with a set of keys and the original property deed. "You've always been the one who showed up." Dylan never did. He had owned a small yoga studio on the edge of town for over 30 years. It was a simple brick building with cracked windows, worn wooden floors, and a single large room lined with mirrors. Attached to it was an old delivery truck he used to haul mats, blocks, straps, and sound equipment to outdoor classes in the park. The place hadn't turned much profit in the last decade. The equipment was outdated, the heating system unreliable, and the parking lot needed repaving. My family dismissed it immediately. "That old thing," my father said over dinner the next evening. "It's barely worth the land it sits on. Sell it quick and split the money." My mother nodded. Dylan shrugged and changed the subject. I didn't argue. I simply took the keys and drove to the studio the following weekend. The door creaked when I unlocked it. Dust floated in the sunlight. The mirrors were streaked. The walls needed paint. And the truck in the back lot had a flat tire, but the space felt solid. It felt like something that could be fixed, something that could belong to me. I started small. First, I cleaned. I scrubbed the floors until the wood shone again. I washed the mirrors with vinegar and newspaper until they reflected clearly. I patched cracks in the walls with spackle and painted the entire interior a soft sage green. The truck took more time. I replaced the tire, changed the oil, and had the brakes checked. Every expense came from my savings account, the one I had built quietly since high school. I didn't ask my parents for help. I didn't tell them how many nights I worked late at the office, then drove straight to the studio to sand baseboards until my hands blistered. Learning to run classes was harder. I had taken yoga sporadically in college, but teaching was different. I enrolled in an online certification course and practiced sequences in the empty room until my voice stopped shaking. My first class had 3 students, a retired nurse, a young teacher, and a college student who wandered in off the street. I taught for free that day. They came back the next week. Word spread slowly through local Facebook groups and the community bulletin board at the library. The truck became my lifeline. I loaded it with rolled mats, bolsters, and a portable speaker. On weekends, I drove to the park across town for sunrise sessions. People liked the fresh air, the open space. The way I kept the classes gentle and encouraging, no one was judged for modifying poses or arriving late. I never raised my voice. I listened and they kept coming. Nights were long. I worked full-time at the office from 9 to 5, then headed to the studio. I taught 2 evening classes, cleaned up afterward, and often stayed until midnight updating schedules or answering emails from new clients. Weekends meant more classes, more driving, more loading and unloading. My hands were rough from hauling equipment. My back ached from carrying stacks of mats. But every time a student thanked me after class, saying they felt calmer than they had in months, the exhaustion felt worth it. I never mentioned the struggles to my family. When my mother called to ask how things were going, I said, fine. When Dylan texted asking if I needed help, I replied, I've got it. I didn't want their opinions. I didn't want their pity. This was mine. Months turned into a year. The studio slowly changed. New mats replaced the old ones, thick, grippy, and soft colors. I installed better lighting and a small sound system. I added shelves for props and a corner with tea and blankets for after-class relaxation. The truck got a fresh coat of paint and new tires. Classes grew. What started with 3 people became 8, then 12, then 20. I raised prices slightly, but kept them affordable. People came back because they felt seen. One Saturday morning, after a packed outdoor session in the park, a group of regulars stayed behind to talk. This place feels like home, one woman said. You make it easy to come back. I smiled and thanked them. Inside, something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. The studio wasn't perfect. The roof still leaked during heavy rain. The heating system rattled in winter. But it was mine. I had earned every inch of it. And as the months passed, the value grew, not just in dollars, but in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've done something real. The studio began to thrive in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. Classes that once drew a handful of people now filled the room. Evening sessions sold out a week in advance. Weekend workshops in the park drew crowds, 20, 30, sometimes more. I had to buy extra mats and blocks just to keep up. The truck was on the road almost every day hauling equipment to different locations. Revenue doubled within 6 months. I hired a part-time assistant to handle registration and cleaning so I could focus on teaching. For the first time, the numbers on my spreadsheet showed black ink instead of red. People talked about the studio. They liked the atmosphere, calm, welcoming, no pressure to be perfect. I never pushed anyone into advanced poses. I adjusted sequences for injuries, offered modifications without comment. Students started bringing friends. A local wellness blog featured me in a small article. Hidden gem in town, it said. Bookings kept coming. Then the phone calls started. My mother called one evening while I was locking up. Studio's getting busy, huh? She said, her tone light but curious. I heard from Mrs. Larson at the grocery store. She said she went to one of your classes. Said it was packed. I paused, key in the door. Yeah, it's going well. She paused too. That's good. Really good. The conversation ended quickly, but something felt different. She had never asked about the studio before. A few days later, Dylan showed up unannounced. He walked in during a slow afternoon class wearing jeans and a hoodie, hands in pockets. Hey, Alex, he said after the students left. Place looks different. Nice job. He looked around, nodding like he was appraising real estate. I've been thinking. You're doing great, but it's a lot for one person. Let me help manage it. I could handle the business side, scheduling, marketing. We could make it bigger. I wiped down a mat and kept my voice even. I've got it under control. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Come on, we're family. Why not share the load? I shook my head. I built this alone. I don't need help. He left without pressing further, but the visit lingered in my mind. The next week, he texted, talked to Dad and Mom. They think it's unfair you have the whole thing. Maybe we split the profits 50-50ths. Family should benefit together. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, no, it's mine. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his tone shifted. You're working too hard. You look exhausted. Doing this alone is going to burn you out. You're not strong enough for this long term. I didn't answer. I put the phone down and went back to preparing for the next class. But the words stayed with me like a splinter under skin. He called a few days later. Listen, Alex, everyone in the family thinks I should be the one running it. I'm better at the big picture. You're good at the details, but this is getting too big for you. You said once that if it ever got valuable, we'd figure something out. Remember? I remembered no such conversation. I never said that. He sighed. You were tired. You probably don't recall, but we can fix this. Just sign a simple agreement, shared ownership. It's fair. I hung up. My hand shook. I sat on the studio floor staring at the mats I had bought with my own money. The room felt smaller. Then the envelope arrived. Thick legal-sized, no return address. I opened it at the kitchen table in my apartment. Court documents. Dylan Thompson versus Alexandra Thompson. Petition for ownership transfer of the yoga studio and vehicle. The filing claimed I had verbally agreed to share the property, then withdrew due to emotional instability caused by overwork and stress. Attached were affidavits from my father and mother, stating they had witnessed conversations where I expressed doubt about managing it alone. They signed without hesitation. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. I read the pages twice, then set them down. My chest tightened, my eyes burned. But I didn't cry. I had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. I called James Whitaker, the lawyer I had found through a colleague at work. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "This is weak. No written agreement. No financial contribution from him. We'll fight it." I thanked him and hung up. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. I kept teaching. I kept driving the truck. I kept smiling at students. But every night alone in the studio after closing, I felt the weight of what was coming. Not fear, not anger, something colder, resolve. They thought they could take what I had built. They were wrong. The courthouse felt colder than I expected that morning. I walked in alone, carrying only a folder with my notes. Dylan was already there, sitting between my parents, dressed sharply, looking relaxed. My father nodded at a few people he knew in the gallery. My mother adjusted her scarf and avoided my eyes. James Whitaker greeted me quietly at the defendant's table. "We're ready," he said. I nodded and took my seat. The hearing began with Dylan's lawyer standing first. He spoke smoothly, painting a picture of me as someone overwhelmed by responsibility. "Miss Thompson has shown signs of emotional strain over the past years," he said, listing long work hours, isolation from family, and moments where I had admitted fatigue. He framed it as concern. My client, her brother, only wants to ensure the business is managed properly for her sake as much as anyone's. He called Dylan to the stand. Dylan spoke confidently, voice steady. "Alex has always been the sensitive one," he said. "She gets stressed easily. I've seen her doubt herself. She even told me once she wasn't sure she could handle everything alone. I offered to share the load, but she pulled back. I'm here because I care. She needs help whether she admits it or not." I watched him. His face showed practiced worry. The judge listened without expression. Then my father was called as a witness. He walked to the stand with purpose, straightened his tie, and looked at the judge. "Alexandra is a hard worker," he began, voice firm. "No one doubts that. But she only knows how to grind, not how to see the bigger picture. Dylan is the one with vision. He has a family now. Stability, plans. The studio and truck should go to someone who can grow it properly." He paused, glancing at me briefly. "It's what's best for everyone." My mother followed. She spoke softly but clearly. "We've always worried about her pushing too hard. She shuts us out. Dylan just wants to protect what grandfather built." She nodded toward Dylan, her hand resting on the rail. The gallery murmured. A few heads turned my way. I felt the weight of their assumptions. The quiet daughter, the one who couldn't handle pressure. My hands rested on the table, steady. I didn't shift. I didn't look away. I let them talk. Dylan's lawyer continued, citing emails and texts where I had mentioned being tired after long days. He presented them as evidence of instability. "This isn't about greed," he concluded. "It's about family looking out for one of its own." James made notes, but didn't interrupt. He waited. I waited. The room leaned in their direction. My father sat back down, satisfied. Dylan smiled faintly at our parents. They believed the outcome was clear. The judge flipped through documents, her expression unreadable. She asked a few clarifying questions, dates of alleged conversations, details of contributions. Dylan's answers were quick. My father's were direct. My mother's were supportive. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, because I wanted them to finish first. Every word they spoke added layers to the story they had built about me, and every layer made their foundation shakier. The morning stretched. The lawyer wrapped up his case with a final plea for fair resolution. The judge nodded once. We'll hear from the defense after recess. The gavel tapped lightly. During the break, I stepped outside for air. James joined me. They've said a lot, he noted. That's good for us. I nodded. The sun felt warm on my face. I breathed steadily. When we returned, the room settled again. My parents whispered to Dylan. He looked confident. My father crossed his arms, certain. The judge called the court to order. James stood. But before he spoke, Judge Ramirez looked directly at me. The room quieted completely. I knew the next part would change everything. James Whitaker stood slowly. The courtroom had gone quiet after the recess, the air thick with expectation. He walked to the bench carrying a thin binder. Nothing dramatic, just precise. Your Honor, he began, voice calm and even. With the court's permission, the defense would like to present evidence that directly addresses the alleged verbal agreement. The judge nodded. Proceed. James opened the binder. First, we have a series of text messages and emails exchanged between the plaintiff, Mr. Dylan Thompson, and my client, Miss Alexandra Thompson. He handed copies to the clerk who distributed them to the bench and the other side. These messages were sent after the studio began showing significant growth, after classes filled, after revenue increased, after the value became apparent. He read one aloud. The date was 6 months after I had started turning a profit. Now that the studio is actually worth something, you need to share it with me. It's only fair. Family doesn't keep everything to themselves. Another one. A few weeks later. Mom and Dad agree this shouldn't all be yours. Sign the papers before this gets complicated. Dylan shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something. Dylan's face tightened. Those were just conversations, he said quickly. I was trying to reason with her. James didn't look at him. Reasoning, he repeated. Let's look at the timing. These messages begin precisely when the business showed profit, not before, not during the alleged verbal agreement. He turned to the judge. There is no record of any prior discussion about sharing ownership. The room felt smaller. My father's arms uncrossed slightly. My mother's hands clasped tighter in her lap. James continued. Next, we have financial records. He placed another set of documents on the table. These are invoices for new mats, blocks, bolsters, and sound equipment purchased for the studio. He pointed to dates, all dated several months after the supposed verbal promise to share. If there had been any agreement, there would be shared contributions. There are none. Every receipt lists Miss Thompson as the sole payer. Dylan's lawyer objected. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the verbal agreement. The judge raised a hand. I'll allow it. Continue. The plaintiff's table began to stir. Dylan looked at his lawyer, eyes wide. My father leaned forward, jaw set. James took a breath. Finally, he said, we have a recorded phone call. He placed a small device on the table. This is an audio file from a conversation between the plaintiff and my client, recorded legally by Miss Thompson for her own protection. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. James pressed play. Dylan's voice filled the room, clear and impatient. Just sign the transfer papers, Alex. You're not going to manage this forever. You're too fragile for it. Sign now before I have to sue and make this ugly. You can't handle it alone. The recording ended. Silence swallowed the courtroom. My mother turned her face away from the bench, staring at the floor. My father lowered his head, hands gripping the rail. Dylan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. The judge looked at Dylan. Mr. Thompson, do you recognize this voice? He swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. Do you deny making this statement? He hesitated. I was frustrated. Frustrated? The judge repeated. Her tone sharpened. You claim concern for your sister's well-being, yet this recording suggests coercion. You reference a lawsuit as leverage. You call her fragile while demanding she sign over property she owns outright. Dylan tried to speak. I didn't mean. The judge cut him off. You referenced a prior verbal agreement in your filing. Yet the evidence shows no such agreement existed before the business gained value. The messages you sent came after success. The purchases were made solely by Miss Thompson. And now this recording shows you pressuring her to sign under threat. She turned to my father. Mr. Thompson, you signed an affidavit stating you witnessed conversations about sharing. Do you stand by that? My father's voice was low. We thought it was understood. Understood, the judge said, or assumed after the fact. She looked at my mother. Mrs. Thompson. My mother didn't lift her eyes. We wanted what was fair. The judge leaned back. Fairness is not determined by who benefits after the work is done. This court sees a pattern. Pressure applied only when the asset became valuable. No evidence of prior agreement, no financial contribution from the plaintiff, and clear attempts to coerce transfer. She addressed Dylan directly. Your claim relies on portraying your sister as incapable. Yet the records show consistent management, growth, and responsibility on her part. The evidence contradicts your narrative. The room stayed still. No murmurs now, just the weight of what had been revealed. James returned to his seat. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. I sat without moving. The truth had spoken for itself. And it had been devastating. The judge returned after a short recess. The courtroom was silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked across the room at each of us in turn. When her gaze reached me, it lingered for a moment longer. I have reviewed all the evidence, she began, voice steady and deliberate. The plaintiff's claim rests on an alleged verbal agreement to share ownership of the yoga studio and associated vehicle. The supporting affidavits and testimony suggest emotional instability on the part of Miss Thompson as the basis for intervention. She paused, letting the words settle. However, the defense has presented clear documentation, financial records showing sole responsibility for all improvements, purchases, and operational costs. Communications from the plaintiff only appear after the business gained measurable value. And most significantly, a recorded conversation in which the plaintiff explicitly pressures Miss Thompson to sign over ownership under threat of litigation. She turned to Dylan. This is not concern. This is opportunism. Dylan sat rigid. His lawyer made a small movement, but the judge continued. The court finds no credible evidence of any prior agreement. The handwritten will from Mr. Harold Thompson is unambiguous. Full ownership to Miss Alexandra Thompson. No financial contribution from the plaintiff has been demonstrated. No pattern of shared management exists. The claim is denied in its entirety. She looked at Dylan and my parents. Furthermore, any continued attempts to harass, coerce, or challenge Miss Thompson's ownership may result in additional legal consequences, including contempt or civil penalties. This matter is closed. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The room exhaled. A few people in the gallery shifted. My father stared straight ahead. My mother's hands trembled slightly. Dylan's face had gone pale. I stood up. For the first time that day, I spoke. Your Honor, I said, voice clear in the stillness. May I address the court? Judge Ramirez nodded. You may. I turned slightly toward my family. They looked smaller somehow. I've spent my entire life being told who I am, I said. That I'm responsible but not capable. That I'm hardworking but not visionary. That I should step aside because someone else deserves more. No one ever asked how I was doing when I worked 2 jobs to pay for the studio. No one came to see the late nights, the repairs, the classes I taught when I was exhausted. No one offered help. They only noticed when it started to succeed. I paused. The words came easily now. You signed statements saying I was unstable. You said I needed protection. But the only thing I needed was to be left alone to do what I've always done. Take care of myself because you never did. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother looked down at her lap. Dylan stared at the floor. I'm not angry, I continued. I'm just done. I sat back down. The judge gave me a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Then she rose. The bailiff called, "Court is adjourned." I gathered my things. James Whitaker touched my arm lightly. "You did well." I thanked him and walked out without looking back. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting the noise of the city wash over me. No triumph, just release. That evening, I went back to the studio. The last class had ended hours ago. I locked the door behind me, turned off the main lights, and left only the soft glow above the mirrors. I sat on the floor in the center of the room, legs crossed, hands resting on my knees. The space was quiet, no music, no voices, just the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the old building settling. I thought about the years before. The silence I had carried like armor. The nights I had worked alone. The moment I realized speaking up never changed their minds. Today I had spoken not to convince them, to close the door. My phone buzzed in my bag. I pulled it out. Messages from my mother, "We need to talk." A voicemail from Dylan, "This isn't over." I listened to none of them. I opened my contacts one by one. I blocked their numbers. Then I blocked them on every platform. I didn't hesitate. I didn't explain. Weeks passed. Word spread quietly in the local community. People who knew Dylan from school or neighborhood events heard about the lawsuit. Some stopped going to his occasional classes. Others whispered at the park sessions. No one confronted him directly, but the bookings dropped. Students chose the studio that felt safe, not the one tied to family drama. My parents faced their own quiet consequences. Neighbors who used to wave now nodded politely and kept walking. Friends from church asked careful questions, then stopped asking. They weren't shunned, just distanced. A subtle shift that happens when people choose sides without saying a word. I didn't gloat. I didn't check on them. I simply lived. Every evening after the last student left, I closed the studio myself. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and sat for a few minutes in the dark room. The mirrors reflected nothing but stillness. That was enough. For the first time in my life, I understood that silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't endurance. It was choice. A deliberate decision to protect what I had built, to guard the space I had earned, to refuse anyone who thought they could take it because they believed they deserved it more. I had carried silence for so long it felt like part of me. Now it was mine to use, not theirs to demand. And in that quiet room with the world outside moving on without me waiting for approval, I finally felt at peace.